Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. And thank you to Corwin for hosting this. I chose this topic for today's webinar, creating safe spaces for multilingual learners, mainly because I live in Los Angeles. And I've seen firsthand how scared students are, despite the heroic efforts of our LAUSD superintendent, Alberto Carvalho. He's been standing up against the federal government's immigration raids. It's an extreme situation in LA since the masked agents moved in. But it's not only here that multilingual learners need safe spaces. They might need them the most here, but they need them all over the country. In these unprecedented times, LAUSD has had to resort to creating safe zones that cover blocks around schools. They may be the biggest safe spaces, but all of the other safe spaces are just as important. Now, today we have an amazing panel of experts who I know this subject so well, basically because they all regularly write for Language Magazine. So there's going to be a lot of information, and we're going to try and have a free-flowing discussion on this topic. And now, in no order of preference, or it's nothing to do with whether they've written for Language Magazine more than the others, I'm going to introduce the panelists, starting with Dr. Becki Cohn-Vargas, who is a consultant providing professional development and expertise on topics of identity safety, culturally responsive teaching, and bullying prevention. She spent over 35 years as a Spanish bilingual teacher, principal, curriculum director, and superintendent, all the way through from pre-K through 12th grade, and in rural, urban, and suburban school districts. Her daughter was born in Nicaragua and came to the US at the age of 8, where she benefited from supporting bilingual teachers and powerful multilingual learning strategies. Becki has co-authored 4 books on identity-safe teaching, including the best-selling book, Identity Safe Classrooms, K5, Places to Belong and Learn. Now, Dr. Andrea Honigsfeld. She's a professor of the School of Education and Human Services at Malloy University at the Rockville Center in New York. There, she teaches graduate courses related to cultural and linguistic diversity and TESOL methodology. She frequently offers professional learning opportunities, primarily focusing on effective content and language integration studies and collaborative practices for ELD and bilingual dual language specialists, as well as general education teachers. She's co-authored over 60 articles and chapters and co-authored or co-edited over 13 books, over 30 books, 13 of which are national bestsellers. Dr. Diane Staehr Fenner is a former ELD teacher, administrator, and the author of 8 books on multilingual learner education. She's the founder and president of Support Ed, a woman-owned small business based in the Washington, D.C. region that provides professional learning, coaching, and technical assistance to districts and states to empower multilingual learners and their educators. Diane grew up on a dairy farm in central New York State, speaks fluent Spanish and German, and is a first-generation college graduate. Finally, Dr. Debbie Zacarian, the founder of Zacarian Associates, is an internationally recognized expert in strengths-based leadership, instructional practices, and family school partnerships that support multilingual learners, including those experiencing adversity. With over 30 years' experience as an administrator, faculty member, and an educational leader, she's authored numerous books and provides consulting and keynote presentations worldwide. So now we're done with introductions. Let me just say that our plan today is to have a dynamic conversation on this important issue. I'm just going to ask some questions and hope for a free-flowing discussion. Might be a little bit disordered at times, but I think that's the best way that we can get as much into this short period of time that we have. So I'm going to start off with the first question, and I'm going to direct this to Becki, if that's okay. Becki, how can we create a classroom environment where multilingual learners feel safe and included? Their home languages and cultures are valued and celebrated and not seen as a deficit. Becki?
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with this panel, and it's wonderful to see people from all over the country who are participating. I'm going to break up my response into two parts. First, I'm going to talk about the unprecedented moment. We are experiencing a time that in my over 30 years in the field have never seen. And working with families, I'm seeing that they're experiencing anxiety and fear. Kids are being traumatized and re-traumatized, and absences are increasing, bullying is increasing, and that lack of safety means that we have to start thinking about safety before anything else. We know that in January, the Trump administration rescinded a law that previously prohibited ICE from conducting operations on what were called sensitive sites, which included schools and churches. But there is ICE presence in neighborhoods around schools, and there have been even on schools. And arrests have taken place of children as they're being dropped off to school. Elementary school children sitting in the car as their mom gets handcuffed and taken away. And a 15-year-old in LA with special needs who was handcuffed and taken by agents in front of his high school. And then it was actually a mistaken identity case. But school districts are being proactive. There is a process called a safe zone resolution, and school superintendents are working with their boards to sign these resolutions that require ICE to go to the superintendent and not be allowed on campus without a warrant. And they're having a positive effect. There's some examples where ICE showed up at schools, they were denied entry, and they left. That happened in Nashville, where people were refused to give student records and privacy was maintained. Schools are also doing many other things. They're training their whole staff, including cafeteria workers and people who work outside on the yard and doing janitorial services. So everyone is on the same page to provide a safe space for students. They're providing counseling and trauma-informed care. Some schools in New York and LA are even offering online options for students. And there are campaigns to boost attendance, working with local communities and family support, giving legal resources and actually handing out and educating parents about their rights. I'll put some materials that you could look at in the chat. There are lots of things out there. Your schools may already have the policies, and that's where you would start, is looking and finding out what your schools are doing. Excuse me. Now I want to talk a little about what to do inside the classroom. My work and my books have focused on identity safety, which is an evidence-based approach that demonstrates that when students' identities are treated as an asset, then students from many backgrounds, especially ML, multilingual learners, feel connected to school. So the first thing for all of us to do is create that environment where students feel welcomed, valued, and safe. And some examples are framing multilingualism as an asset, validating their cultures in the curriculum. I know my daughter, when she came to the US, Priscilla, she was 8, and she was learning English, and she won a citywide poetry award doing an I am from poem, which many of you have probably done with your students, talking about herself and her background. And that was very motivating. We need to connect to our students' prior knowledge and experience, learn some of their language, help the kids learn from each other, the different languages, and never define a child's identity for them. So we also need to pay attention to how students are being treated by others in the classroom and in the yard. We have to be sure negative stereotypes and microaggressions aren't happening, and offering counter narratives when they may hear or report hearing social media that is very critical or bullying to students from immigrant families. And we need to take action. There's much more that can be said. I want to turn it over to my co-panelists. I'm sure you have some examples also about how to make schools safe for multilingual learners and welcoming.
Would anybody like to step forward? Diane, do you have anything to say on that?
That was such a comprehensive response, Becki. I'm like, what can I even add to that? Just really underscoring what you said. We have to be very intentional about creating that safe space for students, for them to feel valued and welcome and a sense of belonging. And that really begins with focusing on creating those relationships and knowing they don't develop overnight, but realizing, thinking of every student in your class and thinking about, who you have a relationship with. It reminds me of a tool that I have in my one of my books that Dan's giving away, the Bright Yellow Social Emotional Learning for Multilingual Learners. And it's a tool where a student would fill in, you could create, model, take this tool and adapt it, where a student indicates who they feel like they have a relationship with in the building. It could be, a librarian, it could be a custodian, just anyone. We have to really go out of our way to figure out who our students feel safe with. And if they indicate that they don't have a relationship with anyone, then that's a sign to us as educators that we need to really take that first step.
And I'd like to piggyback on one of our participants' beautiful posts. Chloe showed her vulnerability and just mentioned that when we use our students' languages with them, they're the knowers and we're the learners. So we're positioning ourselves as ones who have so much to learn, acquire value based on what our students are bringing to our schools. And that's one other way that we can affirm their identities, not just create an identity safe environment, but also affirming environment for them.
Yeah, and I want to add to what my wonderful colleagues have shared is we really want to create a school and classroom climate that really is our students' home away from home. And we want them to have a real say, not just in their learning, but in what goes on in the classroom, what's on the walls, and more. So, in addition to kind of our moving desks and tables and chairs for parent and group work, we really want to consider how students are going to share in displaying the work that we show, and how to make it a communal space. And I remember years ago with colleagues like are here at the panel, I had the pleasure of presenting at a big conference. Helene Marshall was there, who's a scholar in students with limited and interrupted formal education. That would be the formal way of introducing Helene. But she asked me if I would go out to her car and help her, I want to say, bring in all of the items that she had brought for the training. Now, I brought my computer and all my wires. She brought all these boxes of artifacts that students had shared in her college classroom of their lives outside of the classroom, and how important that was for her to create a professional development space that looked like what students would welcome seeing. So part of creating a home away from home that we really want students to feel and experience is kind of thinking about what would a communal space look like and who would have a voice in creating that. And that's become very, very important in our current climate.
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, thank you, Debbie. I mean, that sort of leads into the next question, which I was going to ask, which is, Andrea, I thought maybe you would like to answer this one. What specific strategies can be implemented to incorporate students' native languages and cultural backgrounds into the curriculum?
Well, that's such a comprehensive question. I'm also going to be asking my fellow panelists to add to what I have to share. The first thing that I'd like to start with is what I learned from Mike Schmoker, from Trevor McKenzie, and many others, is that we should not be covering the curriculum. We should be uncovering the curriculum. It's one of my mottos that I always share with every group of educators that I ever have a chance to speak with. Because if we're covering the curriculum, we're literally putting it to sleep. We're going to be covering it up with a cozy blanket. But what we have to do with our multilingual learners is to uncover, to make meaning. And we can only make meaning if we can make meaningful connections. So that would be my first answer, that when we work with multilingual learners, they need to see themselves, they need to see their lived experiences, their cultures, their home languages represented in the curriculum. Usually the curriculum is rather scripted, or there's a pacing guide, some sort of scope and sequence that educators have to follow. So they might be asking, like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to also respond to our individual students' needs? So bringing supplementary materials, creating, constructing, co-constructing learning opportunities, assessment measures and tools that would celebrate the students' lived experiences, allow them to use their rich family and cultural backgrounds as sources of information. Linguistically, because I think you also asked about that, translanguaging pedagogy will leverage our students' multilingualism as an asset. And Becki started right there. That was one of the first things that she shared with us. So we're going to keep revisiting that, how important it is for us to incorporate bilingual, multilingual books, articles, videos, but not just for us to curate these materials, but invite our students to create these materials. So they will be co-constructing the curriculum, contributing to the curriculum that we're teaching. So let me invite my colleagues to add more ideas to these initial thoughts that I shared with you.
I think it's important in classrooms that have multilingual students and others who aren't multilingual that we don't put kids on the spot, that we don't put them in the position where they're asked to represent their whole culture, but rather create activities like you were saying, Andrea, of lived experience, so they could share. And one of the examples was when I taught fifth grade, we did an activity called How Do You Celebrate the Winter Holidays? Because everyone missed school for 2 weeks doing different things. And then they wrote, they were fourth graders, and then we published it in the newspaper. And it was so wonderful because it was so many different stories, and it showed the wealth of their backgrounds without highlighting or singling anyone out.
Yeah, I love that example. And one thing I would like to suggest is that we ask students themselves. So often we just kind of make assumptions of how they might want to be represented, how they want their languages and backgrounds represented. So I'm a strong advocate of having multilingual learner advisory groups where we ask them themselves and have them provide their experience, what it's like to be a multilingual learner in their school, in their setting. What would they change when it comes to curriculum and other aspects of their educational experience? So we've had great success and a lot of revelations, and just speaking with the kids themselves to provide that input. What might that look for curriculum, for example?
Yeah, and I'd like to add a bit about, what we teach has to be so connected to who our students are, and really honor the tremendous linguistic assets that they bring. And it's helpful to kind of think about probably one of the most renowned scholars, Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas, because they provide the strongest research base about the importance through learning through two languages and closing opportunity gaps that have really persisted. And because so many states in these current times have a seal of biliteracy, it's really helpful to look at Collier and Thomas's 2020 report, where they talk about their 20 years of research that they conducted in 23 of the large and small school districts across 15 states of our country, or representing 15 different states that represented regions all across the United States, and urban, suburban, and rural areas. And what they found when students were instructed in their home language and the target language that they're learning, they found that all students, including multilingual learners of English, did astoundingly well. And they used that word astoundingly. And they reflected that all of the students they studied came from really diverse socioeconomic, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds. And they did astoundingly well in learning a new language, maintaining their home language, and learning content areas across the board. So they know, and so do we, that effective language learning relies heavily on building connections through elements such as students' lived experiences that we mentioned, through their current level of language development in their home language and their target language. And just as Andrea shared, the strategies that we use really should be about supporting students for who they are. And the linguistic assets that they bring really has to be underscored as so important and essential.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful answers. Okay, moving on to the next question. How can the physical space, Diane, sorry, I'll bring you back here again. Diane, how can the physical space of the classroom and school, for example, posters, books, library books, signs, all sorts of things, be made more linguistically and culturally representative?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. And to start to answer it, I want to point out that, teachers have a lot of limits, right? What kind of furniture is provided, what kind of budget, if any, there is for books, how much we know that teachers spend out of their own pockets for materials. So I just want to recognize that and put that out there first. But we want to think about, in terms of physical space, that students really see themselves reflected in the physical space and what's on the walls. And, you've all alluded to this already. And I like to think of it between kind of what's nice to have and what's a must have, right? In terms of physical space. Like, it's great to have all of these like Instagram worthy, rugs, couches, fairy lights, like that's all wonderful, plants, soft lighting. But, the must-haves are we have to think of, the goals for, like I said, students to see themselves, but to also foster this engagement and connection and foster conversations with each other. So we want to have, desks arranged that we can really help foster conversations and collaboration. We want to make sure, to the extent possible, that texts really represent our students and their cultures. And that we have scaffolds that we can see, for example, talk moves posted in the room that students can refer to and know how to use, and anchor charts, things that teachers create. So, we have kind of the nice to have and the must haves, but then I also want to think of beyond the physical space, what's kind of the non-physical must haves, right? Have we built relationships with students? Have we established their trust? Have teachers shown a sense of vulnerability as well and sharing with their students that, I've struggled too. Sometimes I don't always want to talk to my neighbor, or I'm not, always the most motivated learner, for example. So we have to have, kind of the physical and the non-physical coming together. And, another must-have is we're always incorporating our students' cultures and backgrounds and knowing who they are, knowing who's in our classrooms and what, all of the wonderful gifts that they bring. So I'll open it up to others.
Thanks, Dan.
I think another must-have is that all students should have some samples of their work on the walls too, so they see themselves as important contributors in the classroom. And actually, the research on what's called identity safety cues is really relevant here, because the cues that when you see yourself reflected, it's a message that you belong. And the research that's been done on it, most of it in colleges and among higher ed students, but it shows that students do better in school when they see these positive cues, when they see things that show that they matter on the walls and in their environment.
Thanks, Becki.
Yeah, I want to share that what Diane and Becki just shared with us is so important. And like many of us, we have we, our panelists, have the privilege of going into classrooms, a wide swath of classrooms. And it's there that we see examples of what Diane and Becki are sharing. And I thought about this as you both were talking, and I thought about a wonderful teacher, Kelly Brown, who teaches U.S. history of all things, which, multilingual learners may have no anchors for U.S. history. But it's what I notice about her classroom, or what I noticed about her classroom, is it's filled with students' explanations of the concepts they're studying. So if you went into Kelly's classroom, you don't see much of Kelly. You see students' illustrations. The walls are filled with their ideas, their illustrations, their drawings. And what it provides is this wonderful safe harbor and climate for sharing and creatively illustrating ideas, being seen as competent, which is so important, and having something worthy to share. So it's no surprise that Kelly's classroom is sort of this favored space that students really love going to, because it really reflects who they are as people. And it's just a wonderful space that, I thoroughly enjoyed seeing.
And
Thank you.
I'd like to just give one more participant a shout out. Thank you so much for all of you who are dropping your own words of wisdom in the webinar chat. Corinne said that she likes to start the year with exploring language diversity in the classroom and her students' language biographies. So again, acknowledging, validating, and valuing multilingualism in our classrooms are very important. So please keep those ideas coming in the chat. We all are learning from each other.
Yes, thank you all for your contributions. That's very interesting. And thank you, Andrea. Okay, Debbie, I've got a question for you now. How do you find the balance, that's all important balance, so that students feel supported but empowered to become autonomous learners, to empowered to go ahead without too much help?
Yeah, I love this question. How do we strike that balance where students feel so supported, but also grow as autonomous, empowered learners? Is big, big goal of ours. And to answer that, we really have to think about the kind of ecosystems that we're creating. One where students become confident and collaborative and self-aware. It's a place where they understand their power and their place in the community, where they learn to be assertive and receptive in their relationships and their learning. So let's zoom out a little bit. If we look back to the 1800s, when at least American public schools were founded, they were designed to produce obedience, where students were expected to follow the rules and be compliant and defer to authority. Empowerment, not even part of the conversation back then. So if we fast forward to today and we begin imagining something completely different, the question is asking, what if schools help students not just succeed individually, but thrive collectively? What if empowerment meant knowing how to contribute, knowing how to collaborate, and importantly, or as importantly, knowing how to speak up, not just for yourself, but for others too? So how do we support students to nurture that autonomy? I think it comes down to 5 essential conditions. One is safety, another is belonging, a third is being valued, a fourth is feeling competent, and then finally having the confidence to speak up for ourselves and others. That is, when students feel safe, they're more likely to take risks. When they feel they belong, they participate more deeply. When they know they're valued, they show up with confidence. And when they feel competent, they start leading on their own learning. And when they feel confident enough to use their voice, their very special voice, they begin to shape the world around them. But Autonomy doesn't mean that we just step back and let them figure everything out alone. It means we provide the scaffolding, something we discussed earlier. That is by modeling how to collaborate, how to listen, how to think as learners, and even as co-teachers with us within the content that we're having students study. Like the student on a hiking trail, I was thinking about this because I live in a wooded area with a lot of hiking trails. And I thought about, a student on a hiking trail who sees a classmate falling behind him. And he decides to turn back and walk with that student. Or a group of students exploring why leaves turn, colors in the fall, those beautiful, brilliant colors that leaves turn up here in New England. And they begin forming theories, asking questions, contributing ideas together. That is empowered learning. Not just the loud and assertive moments, but the quiet ones, the socially responsible ones, the curious ones, the ones where students realize, I'm part of something bigger and I have something to offer. So again, how do we find that balance? We listen, we adapt, we teach students to see themselves as contributors, not just consumers of knowledge. We build classrooms where every student has a voice and an important role. Because the goal isn't just well-behaved students who finish their work. It's the whole human who can think, adapt, collaborate, and meet the challenges of their time. Part of that includes teaching students how to be assertive and respectful in appropriate ways, to disagree politely, to share their ideas, to express curiosity, stand by their thinking, and be opening to changing their thinking. At the same time, we have to nurture receptivity. So we nurture assertiveness and we nurture receptivity, that ability to listen deeply, notice how others are feeling, reflect before responding, and find common ground, and support, very importantly, support the ideas of others. These are skills, not traits. They're teachable and they're super essential. And we teach them not just by telling students what to do, but by modeling, even in small moments. Like when a student says something like, I can't wait for lunch. Instead of redirecting, we can respond with, I'm hungry too. That moment says, I hear you, you matter, and it builds trust and connection. And when students experience that kind of interaction over and over and over again, they internalize it and it becomes part of who they are and how they show up in the world.
I was so excited that you mentioned scaffolding and collaboration. Collaboration is, of course, my middle name, but but scaffolding is something that I'm so excited to talk a little bit about because in Language Magazine, under Dan's leadership, recently we published an article that I'm going to put in the chat, which is freely available, right, Dan? I don't want to make
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, that version that I just posted is going to be accessible to everyone. Where my co-authors, colleagues, collaborators, Carrie McDermott Goldman and Maria Dove and I unpacks the complexities of scaffolding around 9 dimensions. But ultimately, we want to be very careful not to over-scaffold, not to nurture learned helplessness, not to put the students in a position when they're waiting to be rescued. So how are we strategic and intentional about using scaffolds? So there's just not one right way to use scaffolding. That's why I'm so excited to share that resource with you. And as Diane earlier shared a free companion website to her book, I'd like to do the same so that those of you who would like to look for free tools, anything that's available to you. We're just putting so much in the chat box that you could tap into and utilize in your own work. And finally, I want to mention one of my absolute favorite phrases. English is my third language, so I'm fascinated by phrases, language chunks, words. I'm still learning new words all the time. So this favorite word or phrase rather that I'd like to share with everyone is tolerance for ambiguity. which comes out of a research study regarding what are the characteristics of a successful language learner. And we all know that there are so many characteristics, but one that gave me pause, and I always bring it again to every group, is this notion of risk taking. But us as educators being able to teach tolerance for ambiguity, creating learning opportunities in which the students take educated guesses, when they embrace making mistakes, when they know that language learning is pattern making. It's going to take time to figure out those regular and irregular patterns that languages have. So scaffolding and collaboration, Becki. And Debbie, of course, we're all collaborating and all scaffolding here.
This is a topic we could go on and on about. I thought of something in terms of helping kids become self-directed and develop autonomy while feeling supported. And it's a formative assessment cycle where you basically communicate to children and students of all ages that you really have high expectations for them and you believe they can meet those expectations, and you want to be able to give feedback and support and look at progress. So you start with children or the student saying, where am I going? Trying to think about what they're trying to learn and let them figure out that they're on a path toward learning it. And then they get the feedback and they learn from some of their mistakes, where mistakes are celebrated as opportunities to learn. And then you say, well, where am I now? And then you look at going to the next step. And then the final step, where am I going next? And that cycle, getting them to look at their own learning and thinking, is a wonderful thing. And when you communicate what's called wise feedback, that you believe in them and you are here to help, you're communicating both messages of support and of giving them that self-directed learning. And then they're able to hear things that you might give them suggestions on how they can improve.
Thank you, Becki. Would anybody else like to chime in on this?
I'm just picking back up on something. Many of the things Debbie said just, got me to thinking. And she mentioned, we want our students to have confidence to speak up for themselves and others. And that is definitely a goal we have for our students. And if we unpack that a little bit more, we think of what schooling, what expectations look like in students' home countries. And is that always, it comes back to kind of to knowing who our students are, where it might be, in students' home cultures, that might not be the expectation. So how do we honor and value and affirm what they bring with them, their way of knowing, their way of schooling, what they see at home, and their shared experience with what the U.S. expectation might be for self-advocacy. So that's a really interesting area. One of my, if Andrea's middle name is collaboration, then mine is advocacy, I think. So one area, we can think of is, what does it look like to self-advocate? Is that expected? How do we want our students to get there? I used to, for example, I taught in Mexico, and the teacher was the figure of authority. No one would question the teacher or a policy, so it's just something to think about when you wake up at 3 a.m. and have these deep thoughts. So thanks. I want to just thank everybody for bringing up these really important points.
Okay. All right. So we'd like to go back to Diane again. And this is a little bit of a tricky question, but I think it's important. And one thing, and it's sort of like to end with this one. So how can you encourage your students to open up without them feeling embarrassed or weak in front of their peers? And how can you deal with that peer pressure type situation?
Right. And this is something that we see when we're in classrooms when we're coaching or doing, walkthroughs or needs assessment, learning walks. We recognize that students, and we hear this also through our student advisory groups with multilingual learners, as they get older, they get more and more self-conscious, right? Any student will. And then we have the added complexity of being a multilingual learner where they say, if I talk in front of everyone, they're going to laugh. I'm going to make a mistake. They're going to laugh at my accent. So, it comes back to, to many things like that many of you have said, having students feel comfortable, having them feel a sense of belonging. One of you mentioned in the chat that you're learning some phrases in Spanish so your students can see that you're vulnerable and you make mistakes as well. So really setting the stage. And you've also mentioned, to take risks and how important that is in being a language learner. And so, some things to consider are really having a focus on peer learning and structured conversations for our multilingual learners. So where they understand, they kind of know the rules of what our expectations are, and really reframing, kind of this one teacher asking a question and this one student answering in the large group to the expectation that they're talking with each other. Paula Gibbons, a researcher on scaffolding, says the goal should be about 30% of the time that students should be interacting with each other in the classroom and talking and having these conversations. And so another thing, we've noticed, of course, an uptick in students being quiet, especially coming back after COVID in school, in-person school closures. And so it's great to see now how so many states in the US are banning phones. I want to see banning laptops to the degree possible next, because man, when I'm in classrooms and I'm behind a student on a laptop, many times they're playing video games, they're watching Netflix, all this stuff they shouldn't be doing. So I'd love to see more interactive activities, paper, manipulatives, realia, and less of a focus on technology. So I don't know what do others think?
Debbie?
Yeah, I think all the ideas Diane just shared are so, so important. And I think I want to kind of add a little pitch about a wonderful teacher, Tina Kern. Diane began talking about high school and how that's difficult. Tina is a very seasoned high school ESL teacher. She told me a story that illustrates the importance of supporting everyone to feel safe, sense of belonging, value, and competence, and as importantly, the confidence to speak up. So Tina's story is from the first day of school, not that long ago, for, September, whatever date we're in, where she noticed the student, Anna. She described her as a very small, quiet person sitting alone, clutching her school-issued tablet like a shield. And when their eyes met, Tina shares that Anna seemed to visibly flinch when she looked at her. But Tina didn't see fear in Anna. She saw Anna's courage. And that's really important to think about. Anna had just arrived to the United States. She didn't know anyone, and she barely spoke a word of English. So what did Tina tell her? She said, "You're incredibly brave." And she told her that every day. "You're so courageous to come here. You're so brave. I'm so proud of you for coming to school every day." And what was Tina's reward? A small smile from Anna. Weeks passed. Then one day, Anna spoke the first full sentence in English. At first, the class was silent. And then what did they do? They applauded Anna. That moment wasn't just transformative for Anna. It meant something for everyone in the classroom, because students open up and they share when they feel safe, seen, and celebrated. So Tina's story reminds us that this is what's possible when we're truly in it together. And when we're in it together, students like Anna and everyone else feel so safe, sense of belonging, value, competent, and the confidence to speak up on behalf of themselves and others.
Thank you, Becki.
That's such a moving sort of example of what it can be like, and especially when the trust is built in the classroom. And I saw a good example that Chloe put on the chat about that, just a discussion about how we all have different accents. And it just kind of puts everybody in a kind of an equal stance. It's like we all talk a little differently. And I know that we also have different ways when we transfer from one language to another. I know my daughter always used to say station gas instead of gas station, because that's how it would be in Spanish, estación de gas. And so just highlighting that and making it all, we're all kind of speaking languages and speaking different ways. Another person wrote, or Chloe, I guess, wrote this also about allowing different kinds of ways to express what you learned, writing a song or a translation with subtitles for a foreign exchange student, different kinds of activities that students can do that allow them to come forward. And of course, just breaking up the conversations, partner chats, allowing kids to talk one-on-one opens everybody up and gives everyone a chance to speak. So there's so many ways to do it. Once you kind of open it up, it can be really a wonderful thing, and it kind of begins to work away at that little shyness and embarrassment, and also not correcting people all the time if they do make a mistake, not embarrassing them or humiliating them, or allowing students to make fun of each other, which does happen.
And earlier in the chat, Maria raised, one of our participants, a really important question, concern, that we're centering our multilingual learners, but what about our multilingual, multicultural educators who also need a safe space, who also need a voice? They also need to have advocacy and collaboration and just about everything that we talked about. So I often turn to Paul Gorski's Equity Literacy Framework, and I just put that in the chat box. He offers free self-paced mini courses, tons of articles that are also free on this particular website that I just put in the chat box. And thank you, all of you who are thanking us for the resources. That's what it's all about. Not one person can be the holder of all the knowledge, all the information, all the expertise. So we need to share, we need to collaborate and pass on all of those resources that address the complex needs of not just the students, but also faculty and staff and administrators who might feel that their voice is not heard, their experiences are not valued within a school context. And we know that school culture is what we do, and school climate is how we feel. And it takes a village to co-construct those cultural and other aspects of the workplace that needs to be safe for everybody who enters that building.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Andrea. Was there anybody else like to add anything else onto the end of those answers, responses? I'm not sure if we have any time for any questions.
Okay, we do have one question that just came in from Crystal. What is a good way to help students feel proud of their L1 who are from a language background that no one else in the school speaks?
Oh, I can speak to that, since my home language, my mother tongue, is Hungarian, and just about nobody speaks that anywhere I go. So how do we address the less commonly spoken languages? I often challenge teachers that they should learn 20 sentences just to begin in every language that's spoken in their classrooms. So a child who speaks an unusual, rare language could all of a sudden hear the teacher trying to formulate those hard to pronounce sounds, trying to make connections through cognates, trying to not make too many mistakes, both with the pronunciation and the grammar. So it turns into a game-like activity and a celebration around all languages being valued, even the less commonly spoken rare languages.
Thank you.
Okay, and we do have another question that just came in. What advice would you give to teachers doing their practicums to support MLs?
Ooh,
I want to
I think
unpack
we-
that question even more. Like, there's so much I want to know. In which content area, which grade level? Is this for a future ELD teacher? Is this a content teacher? I guess just one kind of blanket piece of advice is to observe and connect with teachers that you think are doing a great job, even if as a pre-service teacher, haven't had a lot of methodology in teaching multilingual learners. You can tell, right, going in, who is trying, who is connecting with students, who's valuing students. And so I would suggest, one place to start is observing those teachers and talking with them and getting their advice.
I would add that, and I'm drawing on Brandolin Tosalt's work that has made a real, I want to say, deep impression on me in terms of my thinking. She asks us to really ask students, how do you perceive I care about you? So, asking that question, how do you perceive I care about you, is so important because if we're going to build relationships, we want students to feel that we care and that they care about us. So I think those are important questions, or a very significant question to ask. And it's also important to ask that at the very beginning. What would be important to you to show that I care for you? And multilingual learners coming from very different experiences. Like Andrea said, I speak Hungarian. Most students don't speak Hungarian. Well, how in Andrea's background would that expression of care appear? And what Brandolin found is that students have very different perceptions of how teachers show caring. So for some, it might be, well done, you did a great job. And for others, it may be a hand on a shoulder. For others, it may be making eye contact. All of these various ways that we show care are so, so important in terms of that big question that you asked.
I'd like to come back to Brian's comment because now we know that Brian is a program supervisor working with teacher candidates. So I do that a lot too. I still have a full-time job at Molloy University where I do exactly the same thing that you're doing. So I'd also like to give a huge shout out to our dear colleague who's no longer with us, but we honor her work tremendously, and that's Ivania Soto. And she contributed to our field with her work related to shadowing English learners. So that's a powerful learning experience for any pre-service teacher and in-service teacher. And you could look at Ivania's work or create your own shadowing protocol, but allowing a teacher candidate, a practicum participant, to simply follow that child throughout the entire day and observe what the child is doing, how that student is able to or has some challenges to fully participate in the various learning activities. I know Melissa is signaling me that we're almost at time, so I'm wrapping that up very quickly. But thank you so much, Brian, for that question, and Diane for sharing Ivania's book, which is, of course, still available. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank our moderator and panel for your participation today and everybody who joined us. And I wish everybody a good morning, evening, wherever in the world you are, and have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.